Welcome to the Healthy AF podcast. In this episode, we answer the questions, what is gluconeogenesis and why you don't need to eat every few hours to stabilize your blood sugar. I'm your host, Zane Griggs, sharing with you what I have learned in 25 years as a fitness professional about nutrition, exercise, sleep, and many more lifestyle strategies to help you become healthy AF, healthy after 50. Now, what is gluconeogenesis? Well, it's a function of the liver, and to some degree, the kidneys do this too, but primarily the liver, to create glucose in an effort to stabilize or regulate your blood sugar. It basically keeps blood sugar in a functional range between meals when you're not eating. Now, have you heard people say you have to eat in order to regulate your blood sugar? I certainly have. I've even heard fitness professionals say this, people with lots of experience, and it blows me away that they still don't understand that that's the role of the liver. And we couldn't have survived as a species for this long if we need to eat every few hours to survive. The fact that we're able to eat every few hours or whenever we feel like it is really a new phenomenon, right? It's really maybe the last 150 years or so. So I've heard people say they have to eat every couple of hours to regulate their blood sugar because they have like hypoglycemia and low blood sugar. That's not normal. That's not how it's supposed to be. They may have some sort of insulin resistance or something that's keeping them from being able to burn fat effectively, or just having a sort of hormonal response that is unusual to when keeping their blood sugar levels stable. We don't need to go deep into that, but that's not how it's supposed to be. That's not normal. It could just be the way they've eaten over the years to train their body to expect sugar coming in all the time. They're not used to it. They haven't adapted to something, to a lifestyle or eating habits that allows them to go 4, 5, 6, or even 8, 12 hours between meals. Now, what is the source of the glucose that the liver uses to regulate our blood sugar? Well, that is the process of gluconeogenesis. It's primarily comes from amino acids. So it uses 18 of the 20 essential amino acids. Now, I don't expect you to know all the essential amino acids, but, well, I'll get to that in a second. It can also use glycerol. So when people say, well, we can break down fat, blood sugar, well, not exactly. So we have a triglyceride, which is made up of 3 fatty acids. That's the tri. And the glyceride is the glycerol, which binds those 3 fatty acids together to make the fat molecule. Triglycerol is just a fat molecule, right? And so when we break down fat, we can't actually use the fatty acids to convert to glucose. Fatty acids don't convert to glucose. We just burn them as fat and make energy. But the glycerol that holds those 3 fatty acids together to make that molecule can be converted to glucose. Now, it's not as much, we don't use this glycerol as much for gluconeogenesis as we do amino acids. It's much smaller amount compared to amino acids. Maybe a single digit percentage that we use from glycerol burning fat for most people. Most of it comes from these amino acids. And I mentioned it was 18 of the 20 essential. The reason that's important, or at least I want to point out, I think it's important, is because those 2 it does not use are 2 called leucine and lysine, which are the 2 amino acids we need in specific amounts in a specific dose or in a specific meal, like in a set meal, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So you need a certain number of grams in a dose of protein of leucine and lysine. It's around 2.5 to 3.5 grams each, give or take, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis or muscle growth, muscle protein growth. Those are the 2 of the main aminos that trigger that out of all the 20. And those are the 2 we don't convert into glucose. So it's like your body knows it needs to use protein between meals to create glucose for blood sugar, but it doesn't use the 2 we need to build. They're specifically necessary to build muscle. Wow. What a design, right? Now, does eating a large amount of protein cause your liver to release a lot of glucose into your bloodstream? Or said a different way, does eating a large amount of protein stimulate such a large amount of gluconeogenesis that you spike your blood sugar? Okay, that is often a fear. You hear people say that who are saying, oh, maybe we should eat more fat, a little less protein. You'll hear a lot of that in the keto world. So I'm going to say no, not in a metabolically healthy person. If your liver is insulin resistant, then it may dump more glucose into your bloodstream than necessary when you eat. But that's not because of gluconeogenesis directly. Gluconeogenesis is a set process of converting protein into glucose, and it's very slow. Now, a meal of high protein and fat, say the fat that comes with that protein, so a fatty piece of meat, let's say, right, like a steak or some kind of ground beef, pork chop, something like that. You understand? So the fat that comes with that meat will have a very small impact on blood sugar, and that impact will return to normal. Your blood sugar will return to normal very quickly, especially compared to a mixed meal that might have some carbohydrates in there with the fat and the protein. But that's okay. It's a normal mechanism. That little bump is a normal mechanism for delivering nutrients to tissues all over the body. That's how we get the protein and what is broken down from the meal, from digestion, to the muscle, to other tissues, to organs. That's the delivery method. It's not something to be feared. And again, the rise in blood sugar is very minimal compared to eating a more balanced meal, right? So, if you're going to eat, right, which you have to eat, and you're trying to minimize blood sugar response, a high protein meal really is the way to go. As far as nutrient density, getting the benefit of the nutrient density, the whole purpose of eating is getting the protein and the nutrients that come in that meat, the micronutrients that come in that meat, along with the fat that's in there. Yes, it's all beneficial into tissues, right? So a short, minimal bump in glucose just from the natural act of digestion and of insulin, there's a little bit of insulin that's released to deliver those nutrients to tissues, because that is the role of insulin. It's temporary. It's not chronic. It's not a chronic elevation. It's not even a high elevation that lasts for 3 or 4 hours, like a mixed meal might. Like if you're eating pizza, that could last for 3 or 4 hours. It's not something to be concerned about, especially if you're metabolically healthy. Now, if you're metabolically unhealthy, like you have insulin resistance, we'll talk about that in a second. But understand, you have a normal amount of blood sugar, okay, in your bloodstream at any given time, in the normal ranges, is about 4 grams. It's like 1 teaspoon, just under 1 teaspoon. Actually, it's a little less than a teaspoon. That's not very much, is it? And about 4 grams would keep if you were to take your blood sugar levels, you probably know, you're familiar with what that range is. Usually over 100 is considered, it's 100 to 110, 115 is borderline, 100 milligrams per deciliter. That would be like borderline diabetic. Over 120, you're approaching insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes kind of levels, right? So 4 grams is like 100 milligrams per deciliter. So it's considered the upper end of normal. So again, less than 1 teaspoon of sugar in your blood, in your whole body, puts you at the upper edge of normal ranges. You can obviously have less if you're down around 80 milligrams per deciliter because you haven't eaten in a while or you've been very active. Then I'll be over a little less than that. But it's a very narrow range that your liver has to keep your blood sugar in. If you get below, say, 40 milligrams per deciliter, you're going to start losing your ability to think straight, right? You may not even be standing at that point. You might pass out before you even get there. So there's a very narrow range that has to be maintained, blood sugar, for it to be in normal ranges. Now, the other benefit of eating a large amount of protein is it does create a very larger than eating than carbs or fat, but it creates a larger energy expenditure in the digestion of the protein. In other words, the term you've heard is it increases your metabolism, right? Which basically means you're burning up more energy in the process of eating it. You're actually using calories to digest it. Now, part of that increase in metabolism or energy expenditure comes from the process of gluconeogenesis, comes from converting some of that protein into glucose. It's actually approximately 40% of that energy increase, or that increase in burn, right? Calorie burn comes from the act of gluconeogenesis. It's a very energy costly process and a very slow process, converting those amino acids into glucose. So it's not something you can't compare it to eating a piece of fruit, right? Obviously, which would immediately put glucose in your system. So during the process of gluconeogenesis, the liver actually stops breaking down its own stored glycogen, which it uses to stabilize blood sugar or regulate blood sugar. So it stops breaking down its own glycogen into glucose and starts using the glucose it's converting from amino acids to replace its own glycogen stores as needed and regulate blood sugar. And some of which, some of that blood sugar it's using, or some of the glucose it's putting into your bloodstream is being used to replace glycogen stores in other tissues like muscles and organs and so forth. So it basically stops using what's stored in the liver and starts using what it's converting in the process of gluconeogenesis. Now, the liver will put more glucose into your bloodstream above normal levels in certain situations, okay? Like times of stress. So you have, when you're stressed, or there's a time of stress, cortisol, the hormone cortisol is released, which then triggers gluconeogenesis and the release of glucose. Example of like when you wake up in the morning, right? You get a burst of energy, it raises your heart rate, wakes you up. You feel that, kind of like, okay, it's part of your circadian rhythm. It moves you out of the sleep cycle and into a waking state, right? That's cortisol is released. You get a little release of glucose to give you some energy. It's like a little built-in breakfast, really. And then you begin, to wake up. It gives you what you need to wake up. This can also happen during a workout or intense physical labor, like working outside. You're physically moving, chasing something. You get the physical labor, right? It will give you a little, so you haven't eaten, right? You're not taking your pre-workout to put glucose in your system. Your body knows, okay, we're working hard here. Blood sugar is getting low. We're using up all the blood sugar for this labor. We need more energy. So it spits out an excess amount, knowing that you're going to put it to work. It can also happen during emotional stress, like a fight or flight. Think of a fight or flight kind of situation across the board here. So a car accident, or you're just getting in an argument, or something makes you very nervous or scared, right? It's a bad news, or you see something you wish hadn't seen, right? So those are all situations where cortisol will be released and your body will put out a little extra energy, glucose, to handle the physical needs of that stressful situation. Even if there's no physical requirement, it's still going to put it out because it's a stress response, okay? And that can sometimes become a problem when you have a lot of high frequency of stressful situations where there's no physical movement to use up that glucose, like a lot of emotional stress. And then you have a lot of glucose being put in your system that you're not using for activity. Then it becomes stored as fat. So the problem here is not gluconeogenesis. The problem is the stress, because liver's regulation of the blood sugar and the use of gluconeogenesis is what keeps your blood sugar stable while fasting. So between meals, whether that's a 12-hour fasted window or 4 hours between meals, you're burning fat during that time and you're using some ketones, right? You're breaking down fat, using some ketones for energy, which allows your blood sugar to stay low. But obviously, you're always using some blood sugar. And it's going to need to, since you're not eating, release some blood sugar to keep it in that normal range so you don't go too low. So some blood sugar is always needed. You always need some level of glucose in your blood. The brain is actually the most energy demanding organ. So it uses about 20% of your body's total energy in a day, quite a bit, huh? So we're looking at least, say 120 grams of glucose minimum, right? Which would be that'd be approaching about 500 calories, 480, 500 calories, just from glucose, as long as things were normal, like you had a little supply of it. Minimum. That's minimum. Again, ketones can take up some of this demand if you're keto adapted, right? So your brain cannot burn fatty acids directly. They can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So whatever is burned from a fat source would have to be in a ketone. Would have to be a ketone. So ketone, you can be, if you're fat adapted, if you're ketone adapted, I should say, and the ketones are really flowing, then yeah, it can offset some of that need for glucose up to, in best case, 50 to maybe 75%. That'd be someone who's really ketone adapted. Their ketones are really pumping, right? But that's not the case most of the time, unless you just live in a ketogenic state all the time, or you're in a very fasted state and your body's adapted to it. Most of the time you're using at least half glucose, right? 40% for sure. Now, there's a big difference between glucose from gluconeogenesis and eating a carb, as I mentioned earlier, like eating a piece of fruit. And that is the dose and the speed at which it's absorbed and then hits the bloodstream. It's the liver's job to regulate the amount of sugar going into the blood. So it will use gluconeogenesis as needed to create more glucose and then release the glucose to meet the needs of the body. Again, it's more of an on-demand kind of system, tightly regulated by the liver. When you eat carbs, however, what you eat and how much you eat will determine how much sugar hits the blood and how quickly. As it gets digested and your body goes through the process of metabolizing it or storing it, right? So, and I'm not saying that to say you shouldn't eat carbs at all, okay? That decision, though, should be based on your current metabolic health, your energy needs, your activity level, and the quality of the food that you're eating. So the idea of avoiding a high protein meal out of fear of gluconeogenesis doesn't seem like a valid concern, especially in light of the alternative. So even if you have some level of insulin resistance that you're trying to reverse, eating 1 to 3, let's say, larger meals in a day made up of high protein and the fat that's in that protein, right? The fat that accompanies it really is the best plan to reverse insulin resistance. It's far better than eating 4 to 6 smaller meals throughout the day, which are going to continue to bump insulin every time you eat. Even though it's a small amount, you're still bumping it each time, which, as we know, when insulin is released, it impairs fat burning, right? So if you're working to reverse insulin resistance or maybe even lose some weight, or you're just fine-tuning your diet to remain insulin sensitive for longevity, right, as you age, then food choices and meal frequency are 2 of your best tools for that. Meaning make really good low glycemic food choices, right, and eat less often. And you're going to get a greater benefit because you're going to have greater time between meals to allow your blood sugar to come down to normal, when insulin is not going to be elevated and fat burning is going to be much more available, much less impaired. Put it that way. Now, if you're very metabolically healthy, or you're very active, or you're very lean, and maybe you're noticing some unwanted stress from being in a ketogenic state, maybe some trouble recovering, either from eating like super low carb or doing a lot of fasting, along with a lot of exercise, right? Realize that cortisol is elevated to stimulate the process of gluconeogenesis. And you may be over leveraging this. Now, some people have experienced this. Some people do just fine with it. They're quite happy staying in a ketogenic state. Others, they may be something that they use for a period of time to reverse a condition or as an elimination diet, and then to reset their habits, their eating habits, or something they do periodically as a reset, maybe several times a year, as a reset to get their insulin sensitivity fine-tuned. So I use it as a tool, at certain times, rather than something they continue to stay in perpetually. Make it work for you. But if you're having difficulty, if this sounds like something maybe you're struggling with, you're having difficulty with like sleep, or your blood work shows elevated TSH or low thyroid, or maybe you're not recovering well between workouts, you may want to make some adjustments to how much you're using this tool. this stressor. It's a metabolic stressor, creates stress. That's not a bad thing, right? Just like exercise is a stressor, right? Use it appropriately. Use it enough to get the effect you want, but not so much that it overtrains you or it creates so much stress that affects your sleep negatively and your recovery. I've had to do that myself. So that's something I had to manage all three of those in order to both low carb, the fasting, and my workouts in such a way that I still use them, but not to the degree I was before, because I just wasn't recovering and my sleep was being disrupted, and I was just a little achy all the time. So it was not ideal. I wasn't recovering. So it's showing signs of overtraining, and realized it's not just the exercise, but it's also the way I was eating. So this is one of those topics we discuss in greater detail in the Healthy AF Club. If it's something you'd like to know more about, we'd love for you to join us. You'll find a link to more info about the Healthy AF Club in the show notes. So please check that out.